Because they then obviously knew that this was not a good man.
Well, of course, they loved him.
Oh, there was the love. Okay.
Love conquers all. And in a sense, sometimes they even took his violence as evidence that he cared. Because why would one, if one didn't care, why would one hit someone?
Welcome back to Psychobabble, where we expose bad therapy and liberal narratives that contribute to our poor mental health. I'm Hannah Spear, and today I am giddy with excitement because I get to introduce you to the man who inspired Psychobabble. His name is Dr. Anthony Daniels, and he's written a number of amazing, brilliantly written books under the pen name Theodore Dalrymple. I was first exposed to his book when I was on vacation with my husband, and he read this book to me in front of the fireplace that was called Spoiled Rotten, The Toxic Cult of Sentimentality. And I just remember thinking, that's it. That is exactly it. I had quit my job at the hospital. By then, I had 2 kids, and I was disillusioned and so disappointed in this field, psychiatry, that I loved so much. I was so disappointed in all of my colleagues and everything that I had learned. And I listened to him read this book, and it was just like a huge relief. Because it was the first time that someone really described what the problem is and why we have such a high burden of psychiatric disorders, despite all the resources we're pouring into it. So he's a retired psychiatrist, a prison physician, and he's written for all the major publications since the 1980s. So welcome to Psychobabble, Dr. Daniels.
Thank you very much. Thank you for asking me.
So first, I would like to read this quote I've had from your book since I started this podcast. Psychobabble is the means by which people talk about themselves without revealing anything, and certainly without having undergone the painful process of genuine self-examination. It is, in effect, the public manifestation of self-obsession without any commitment to truth. It's simply brilliant. And with that, I would like to start talking about the book that touched me the most, Admirable Evasions, where you talk about the misconceptions people have in pop psychology. So can we start there? What are these misconceptions?
Well, the first thing is that people want a complete explanation of human psychology, human behavior, and human life. And over the years, psychology has provided several such total explanations, but they're all bogus. We had, for example, Psychoanalysis, which pretended to be able to explain anything. No psychoanalyst really ever said, I don't understand that. And then we had behaviorism, for example, which regarded man as a simple animal with a stimulus and response, and everything was simply a response to a stimulus, which is equally fatuous. It did give rise, I suppose, to cognitive behavioral therapy, which has some value, but apart from that, as an explanation of human existence, it's absolutely miserable. And now we are getting more and more neuroscience, which actually has the effect. There was neurochemistry. I don't know whether you remember that, but people would talk about the chemistry in their brain, though they hadn't taken any chemistry since the age of 14. But nevertheless, they started talking about the chemistry in their brain as if that was the explanation of everything. And now we're getting neuroscientific explanations of everything, which is not to say, of course, imaging is totally useless or anything and there
Yeah.
are uses but in confined circumstances, and this is not the answer to humanity's little problems. So, but the idea that somewhere there is an explanation and therefore a solution outside oneself has become very widespread. And the trouble with it is that it divides people. It divides their mind into two. At one level, they know it's all nonsense, but on the other hand, they observe themselves as if they themselves are an object
Mm.
rather than an object. And that is, I think, very harmful.
Yes, I've often been frustrated in therapy, giving therapy, because I hesitate to say all, but really almost all come in and they wish to sit and talk about something difficult in their past, as if that would relieve them of guilt, of any agency.
Yes, well,
Um,
they have this
yeah.
there's a buried treasure there, which
Mm.
uncovering it in and of itself will solve all their problems. And of course, that's nonsense.
Yes, so that's when you talked about unlocking a memory and that they're all looking for, and I was like, yeah, yes, exactly, exactly. And whenever I would try to pull them out and say, what can we do today that could make it a little better today, or what could be a goal for tomorrow, then they would be annoyed at me and say, because I would interrupt their very important revelation of the past. And what I see psychologists are doing now is that they allow for all of the self-rumination that contribute to the very depression that the patients come in with. And they not just allow, but they encourage it.
Yes, you don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg.
Hmm. Exactly.
There
So,
are actual social consequences of this, because it's the idea that you can't deal with anything unless you can get to the root or fundamental cause of it, which is not true, because there is no root or fundamental cause, because there is no final cause. So you can always go beyond the cause that you think you found. What caused the cause that you think has caused the problem?
mhm.
So this is a recipe, as you say, for rumination. But as Haitian peasants say, behind mountains there are more mountains,
Mhm.
and so that you can go on forever
Mhm.
trying to find the root cause, because there is
Right.
no root.
Did you ever find that worked in all of your therapy sessions, to talk
Uh,
about a trauma or to try to unlock a memory?
Not really, and I think the whole idea of memories which people don't have, or which are not available to them, is not really exact. It is true, for example, that if I asked you to write your autobiography, you
Hmm.
would be surprised by the number of things that you could actually remember about your past, which you don't
Hmm.
constantly dwell on from day to day. That is true. Things that you remember. I'm not saying that it will do you any good to do it, but that will be possible. But people who have really, in my opinion, people who have really suffered catastrophic events in their lives can remember them. They don't forget them, but they put them to the back of their mind and try and get it
Hmm.
along. Or many do. And in fact, I know from personal experience that is so, because my mother did it. She didn't dwell on her past, in thinking that if she dwelt long enough on her past, her life would be made much better.
Where have you seen that? I'm really interested in what, because you discovered this early on, that this doesn't work. These are misconceptions. Where did you see that methods work? Which approaches did you see actually work?
Well, I'm not sure that I actually made things work very often. But one of the reasons I started thinking about this was in prison. Prisoners would tell me all about their childhood as if their childhood explained their present behaviour. And it was true that many of the prisoners had very unpleasant childhood. They had very unpleasant childhoods because of the way people are now living. But that didn't in itself, just saying that, didn't alter their behaviour. And in
Yeah.
fact, if you look at the statistics, you'll see, or at least in Britain, I can't say for the United States, but I think it's the same, the rate of criminality of young men, most criminals are young men, goes down in their 30s. And that's whatever you do. It doesn't matter whether you do anything or you don't do anything. They stop being criminals, or at least they stop being caught, which might not be quite the case, but I think probably is in the case of burglars or so on. That made me think that just uncovering memories of childhood doesn't do any good, which is not to say that they didn't have horrible childhood.
Mm. And a very common factor is the fatherlessness amongst these criminals. That's
Oh, yeah.
what blows me away, and that's just getting worse and worse.
Well, they lived, I mean, in which I worked, the rate of what used to be called illegitimacy, but I can't call it that anymore. At any rate, the rate of non-marriage amongst mothers was 100%, and in the whole country, it's now 52%. And people
Wow.
will always say to that single mothers can bring up children well, which of course is true. They can. I mean, there are single mothers who are capable and good and so on and so forth. That is all true, because there's nothing in this field which is 100%. But if you had to bet on a way of bringing up children, this would not be it. And the fact is that they don't have fathers. And the statistic I am fond of quoting is that a child has a better chance of television in his room than of a father in the house, and by the end of his childhood. And this seems to me disastrous. And I worked in a poor area where one could almost say that the norm was serial stepfatherhood, which was disastrous.
Can
For,
you?
I think, for the most obvious reasons. Really, you don't have to.
Yeah.
You just need a bit of imagination to know what it is for a child not to know who's going to be a member of his household in a year's time.
Yeah. It's devastating what we're doing to we're giving this message that the father isn't necessary, because we want to in our support for single mothers, in a way, to legitimize that, the good job that they're doing. As you said, that's important, but in that we're also very much minimizing the importance of fathers.
Yeah, and it's particularly difficult for those people who have not economic resources. I mean, I'm not a materialist, but the fact is that having economic resources makes things in general a lot easier. And there's one way to be. There's one way for a couple that is not well off to become poor, is to separate.
And do you think that there's a connection between being poor and criminality?
Well, it's not a direct. I mean, there's obviously a correlation, but a correlation is not a cause. I mean, I gave a little talk the other day in which I said the fundamental cause of crime, the necessary and sufficient condition of it, is the decision to commit it. Because if you don't decide to commit a crime, if you don't know that what you're doing is wrong, there is no crime. But obviously, there are reasons why people take the decisions that they do. The decision to commit a crime doesn't come out of the sea like Venus fully formed. it's behind every decision there are causes, and behind the causes of the decision there are more causes and causes of causes and causes of causes of causes. So
Yeah.
you never actually get back to the supposed root cause. And if you've got a population which no longer feels that it has a sense of agency, then it is very vulnerable to commit crime, apart from anything else, because it is able to say it is not really me who committed it. It wasn't I who committed it. It was some fault in my background or in my chemistry or in my
Yeah.
circumstances.
I love that story you told about the man who'd stolen 600 cars or
Yes.
something. Can you tell us about that?
Well, yes, it was a young man
So,
who had stolen 600 cars, and he asked me whether I thought he was addicted to stealing cars. That is to say, he had an illness, which is addiction to stealing cars. And of course, once someone has an addiction, as the National Institute on Drug Abuse will tell you, it's an illness. It's just like Parkinson's disease or multiple sclerosis. It's one of those things that just happens to people. And so, unfortunately unfortunately for the owners of the cars, this man was struck by the illness of stealing cars.
and that is there are a lot of things that are put under the umbrella of addiction nowadays. I remember clearly when Tiger Woods had that affair, and then he came out later at the press conference that I had a sex addiction, and then it was all about this illness that he had developed. It was that's one of these misconceptions, is it not?
I think so. I mean, for example, if you take the more classical kind of addiction, like heroin addiction, it obviously has medical consequences. That is undeniable, and they could be extremely severe, of course, such as death. But in itself, it's not in my opinion, straightforwardly a disease. If you look at injecting heroin addicts, you have to remember that they have much to learn. They have to find out where to get there. First of all, they have to meet heroin addicts. It's not something that just happens like that. They meet heroin addicts. They are taught where to get their heroin. They have to learn how to prepare it. They have to learn how to inject it, how to overcome the unpleasant effects of the drug, and so on and so forth. So it isn't just something that happens to them; it's something that they do. And to treat them as now, you could say, well, actually, that's all true, and to begin with, it's not an illness. But then, once they become addicted, they are truly ill. But there's evidence that many people, in fact, untold thousands of people, have just given up. And you can't say that people have just given up having Parkinson's disease or multiple sclerosis. It's something that is beyond their control. For example, during the Vietnam War, untold numbers of American servicemen addicted themselves to heroin in Vietnam. And in a sense, you could understand it, because war is 99% boredom and 1% terror, and it was horrible for them, and they addicted themselves to heroin. But when they returned to the United States, they gave up. And before very long, their rate of addiction was no higher than that of the recruits who were going to go to Vietnam but didn't go because the war ended. So here we have an example of thousands of people who were addicted to heroin who just gave up. And the reason is obvious. They returned to the United States and were able to resume their life. I hesitate to mention this, but Mao Zedong was an extremely great therapist of addiction because he threatened very severely to punish and even kill people who were addicted to opium.
Oh, really?
And lo and behold, 20 million people gave up because when
Huh.
Mao threatened you with something terrible,
Right.
you knew that he was capable of carrying out his threat.
So, I mean, I'm not going to say that that is someone that we should learn from, but but what can we how can,
I'm not saying we should go out and do likewise, but it should make us think about what the nature of
yes,
addiction actually is.
yes, and now that we have all over, we have a crisis of addiction. How can we make therapy better? You think that's what I'm saying? Yeah, we could
Well,
we could
that's a
learn
very
from it.
yeah, that's a very difficult question. But I remember reading on the website of the NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, that our understanding of addiction had greatly increased, or was greatly improved, largely through the work that the NIDA itself had either done or financed. But at the same time, we were going, or the United States was going through an unprecedented wave of death by
Mm,
drugs of addiction. And
yeah.
these two facts didn't seem to get together very well.
Are you looking to make your home stand out? Do you want visitors to pause at a stunning piece as they enter and say, "I've never seen anything like this. Where can I get one?" I was able to have that for the first time after having Benjamin Hassan design our beautiful, one-of-a-kind ketubah that's now proudly displayed in our living room. He also does landscapes and portraits, anything you want, aptly matching the mood and atmosphere you want to set, creating that moment you long for as you design your home. Go order your favorite piece that will come to mean the world to you at benjaminhassanart.com. That's benjaminhassanart.com and get a discount with promo code Psychobabble Podcast today. Go check it out.
What do
And
you
of
think
course,
about the progression of, because you were there for it, the expansion of the diagnostic manuals over time? And I'm reacting to how many things that they are putting into the same categories, like depression. I think it's a problem that we're not differentiating one thing from the others. Can see two different patients who have the same diagnosis but are completely different, and they would also respond very differently to these medications that we've given them.
the thing is that there's a natural tendency to prescribe because it is worse to miss a genuine case that might have been benefited from prescription than to issue 99 prescriptions which are of no use whatever and even harmful to people, because the doctor is afraid more of missing something than of actually doing good overall in the statistical fashion. So I can
Right.
understand the pressure, but it seems to me that and there are other pressures also when people come to a doctor and say I'm depressed, and he doesn't really have time to
Yeah.
examine the patient's life, and so he prescribes something. And the problem with that, of course, is that once you first of all, you give a problem a diagnostic label, a medical label. Then you go to the doctor gives you medication. So naturally, your idea that you are ill is reinforced. Therefore,
Yeah.
the doctor has to cure you. I mean, that's what the doctor is there for.
Yeah.
And when what he does doesn't work, he has many other things, many other drugs that he can prescribe. And this whole kind of dance or pas de deux can go on for a very long time. And of course, most people get better, or many people get better spontaneously, which they then ascribe to taking the drugs. But if at the end of this process, the doctor says, well, actually, there's nothing I can do for you, the patient very reasonably says, well, what have you been doing all these months or years? And so that actually, this whole process, which is a mass phenomenon, actually, in my view, prevents people from thinking about their own lives in a fairly straightforward but often quite painful way. And I saw lots of examples. For example, women who were treated violently by men, and I saw really hundreds of cases. And when I say violence, I don't mean minor violence. Sometimes it was very major violence. Those women tended to medicalize the men. So they would say there's something wrong with him.
Mm-hmm.
And when he becomes violent, they talk about it as if it's an epileptic fit.
Mm-hmm.
And his eyes go, he doesn't, he's not in control of himself, and so on and so forth. And I mean, this is clearly preposterous. And actually, there's a very good, there was in a certain sense, there was a logic to his behavior, because his violence was usually unpredictable.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't preceded by any one thing that the woman spent a great deal of time and mental energy trying to figure out what it was that provoked it. The whole point was that it was completely at random, which meant that while she was trying to think, how can I avoid this, there was nothing she could do to avoid it except get rid of him, which eventually she would do. But she would claim that there was something wrong with him. And I would say to such a person, I said, well, if he came into this room now, would he behave in this fashion in front of me? Would he do that? Or would he do it in front of the policeman? And the answer, of course, is no. And that very simple question would often make them think about what they've been telling themselves, often for years. Now, it wasn't always a terribly successful ploy, because even if they got rid of this terrible monster, unfortunately, they often found another one, because there are many of them. Because there are many of them about.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the question I always found very interesting is, how did they find them? How did they go about associating with these people, often in serial fashion?
Yeah.
And
What did you find?
What
did you find?
What I found is that they decided to associate themselves with these terrible people in an incredibly casual fashion. They didn't know anything about them. They decided to associate themselves with them after an hour or something like that. And furthermore, they knew the signs that were present. I used to ask them, I said, well, how long would it take me to know that this man that you're associating with is no good? And they would say, oh, well, you would know as he came in the room. Well, if I would know that he was like that as he came in the room, they know what I would know that gave me that insight. And therefore,
What would that be?
Well, their whole appearance, their manner of being, violent tattoos on their bodies and so on. I mean, if you have someone with some kind of violent, with, shall we say, a machete, tattooed on his his arm or something like
Yeah,
that.
that would do it.
I mean,
That would do it.
at the risk of sounding very prejudiced, I would say this might give you a clue. It would make you pretty careful, I would say, of
Yeah.
such a person. But then they would say, well, this is just a prejudice. I said, well, it is a prejudice. Maybe that person is St. Francis of Assisi. It's possible. But I think you would want evidence that he was St. Francis of Assisi before going to live with him.
But they would still, what would be their excuse to, because they then obviously knew that this was not a good man. What was it that they could? Oh, there was the love. Okay.
Love conquers all, and in a sense, sometimes they even took his violence as evidence that he cared. Because why would one, if one didn't care, why would one hit someone?
So it was the passion that they confused the passion for love.
Yes, but actually, the passion. You see, the man actually loved himself, and what he couldn't stand is the fact, because relations between the sexes were so unstable, and because he himself was promiscuous, he wanted the exclusive possession of somebody while enjoying maximum freedom himself. And because he found it very easy to have many women at the same time, he assumed any woman with whom he was living was of the same ilk, and therefore he had to control her. Otherwise, he would lose her, which in the end he always did, but only often, unfortunately, after a very long time.
Mm-hmm. And these were these women who had themselves not had proper male role models. Is that, because I've heard that's the commonality in these women who seek violent men, who are in serial violent relationships, that that is how they learn a strong man to be.
I don't think that is the whole explanation. It can be the whole explanation, because if what I say is true, that these kind of relations became more and more common, it can't be that it all came from the previous generations, because previous generations were not like that. So it's something else, actually, fundamentally, and that really is it's the whole conception of what relations between the sexes should be. And in the 1960s, people thought that if relations between people could be based solely on love and attraction, without anything like convention or responsibility or duty, then the full beauty of the human personality would emerge. And unfortunately, that's almost the opposite of the truth. And it's interesting that as far as social class is concerned, that conception was not acted upon anyway in the higher social classes, but it filtered down to the lower social classes, where its effects were actually much more devastating.
And what role do you think that the psychological community has played here? It is playing. Yeah, where do they get these ideas from?
Well, I think my view is that they actually divide, as I said, people from their own experiences and their own thoughts, so that they come to think of themselves as objects rather than agents. And that means that they're looking for some external source of change. Of course, some external sources of change are necessary. For example, if you're living in a violent relationship, then you need to get rid of the violent person who is committing that violence. But in order to do that, you have to realize that you can do it.
Yeah.
You're not just a victim. You are a victim, but you're not just a victim.
Did you, or you were witness this radicalization, this Islamic radicalization of the
Well, I
youth
saw it.
of
Yes, I
boys?
saw it. I saw it a little. Most were not. Most of them were not radical because they weren't religious. So in the prison, we had a very high percentage of Muslim by comparison with the general population. But they were not. I wouldn't call them deeply religious. On the contrary, they were deeply hypocritical. So they wanted to maintain the system of arranged, not arranged, or forced marriage, which was arranged marriage is it's a very good system, but forced marriage is disastrous.
It's
But they
different, yeah.
didn't mind forced marriage because they got a wife and a sexual partner at home and so on, while they could go out and live their whatever kind of life they wanted, which was often extremely licentious.
Right.
And but they were not really religious. They were not most of them were not observant or only mildly observant Muslims.
Mm-hmm. But they got something from that. So, because I remember, yeah, that they gained something from adhering to. I remember you wrote something about the attraction of Islam to these young boys.
Yeah, well, I mean, some of them, they were not the majority that I met either in the hospital or in the prison, but some of them, needed a change, and eventually realized that their lives were going were meaningless, and so sought a meaning. And one of the reasons, for example, that black prisoners often converted to Islam is that after a time, prisoners want to give up their life of crime. They don't want to come back to prison. They don't mind prison to begin with, but they don't want to spend the rest of their lives in prison, and they want a reason to give up. And many of these people feel they don't want to give in to society. They don't want to say, oh, well, society's been right all along. I've been doing very bad things and I'm a bad person. They don't want to say that. So they don't want to feel defeated by society and feel they have to rejoin society on society's terms. What converting to Islam will do is simultaneously give them an excuse not to be criminal, but also to be still opposed to society, because they know that in their hearts, most people in our society are uneasy about Islam.
Oh, that's so interesting. And that makes a lot of sense, so that you don't have to admit that being in prison for a long time is reformative. That is a big discussion now, whether or not prison is, or if we should reform criminals, if it's curative. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my view is that prison is not a kind of hospital for the soul. And as I indicated, at least in Britain, people get better. I mean, when I say get better, I don't mean they get better in the medical sense. They mature, if you like. spontaneously, whatever you do. Doesn't matter whether you try to rehabilitate them. And even the term rehabilitation I don't like, because it makes it sound as if it's like mental, physical therapy.
Right. Rehabilitation, that was the word I was looking for. I used reformative, but yes, rehabilitation.
Yes, rehabilitation.
Yeah.
No, I mean, however, I feel that attempts should be made, and the reason they should be made is that if you're going to lock up people, deprive them of their liberty, it seems to me that you should try to do something for them, even if what you try to do turns out not to work very much. I mean, I was one of the things I was keen on, and I never succeeded in doing it, was to try and change the culture of the people in prison, because the culture that they came with, popular culture, modern popular culture, to me is absolutely vile and is criminogenic. I mean, you have only to listen to rap songs, for example. So song is perhaps not the right word. I don't know what to call them, but
sounds.
Yeah, rap noise,
Yeah.
and the lyrics are unbelievably vile when you understand them. And they celebrate a form of life which is absolutely disgusting. And unfortunately, many of the people who come into prison have no conception of any kind of culture outside that, which is not to say that they can't be encouraged to realize that there's something better than that. However, trying to get them to realize that is actually quite difficult. It can be done, but it takes a lot of organization and a lot of will. I remember that on the BBC, rather unusually, there was a very interesting program in which people took a Bach cantata, tried to teach prisoners in a very tough prison to sing a Bach cantata. And of course, to begin with, they thought that singing or listening to Bach was akin to homosexuality. But
well,
before long, they were absolutely enchanted by it and enthusiastic and even obsessed. And they'd never heard it before. They probably wouldn't even have heard of Bach before. That's just one thing, and I don't know whether it actually had any effect on their rate of recidivism. That I don't know. But it seemed to me very important that we should try to widen the views, the scope of people's mentalities. Because one of the things that I notice about the prisoners is how deeply enclosed in a very particularly small world they were. And now, I mean, terrible indictment of our schools that our schools didn't do it. But so it'd be a bit late in the day. I remember that we had a professional writer who came into the prison, and he was a very nice chap. And of course, this was for a very small number of prisoners, but those prisoners who wanted to learn to write, not in the physical sense, but to write a story or an essay, or so he taught them, and he told me something that was, I thought, very interesting, is that almost all of them, in his experience, would of course start with something autobiographical, and they would often start about their childhood and so on, and their childhood often been horrible. But what really affected them was when they came to the commission of their first crime. And then they had a kind of writer's block. And he and I interpreted that as confronting them with the falseness of what they had been telling themselves all these years, that they didn't know that what they were doing was wrong, and they couldn't do otherwise than what they had done. And so it was for them a very difficult experience. Now, whether that actually changed their lives and made them less likely to be criminal, that I can't tell you. And in fact, it would be, from the intellectual or scientific point of view, it would be difficult, very difficult to decide, because obviously they were a selected group and so on.
Do you know of any of your previous patients who came out and went straight? Do you have contact with any one of them?
I think many of them probably did, but then I can't say it was because of anything that I did, because you've got this secular trend anyway for people to give up. One thing that did happen, and my wife was with me, I was walking in the city, and a young man came up to me and said, "Do you remember me, doctor?" And whenever anyone says that to me, I say yes, even if it's not true. And anyway, he was an ex-prisoner, and he said, when I came in, I was a heroin addict, and you wouldn't prescribe anything for me, and I said yes, that would be true, but I would have explained why I wasn't prescribing anything for you and in what circumstances I would if necessary. Anyway, he said, I thought that was very hard, I thought we were being very hard.
Yeah.
Hard rather than fair. And he wasn't very pleased, but on his way back to his cell, he thought, well, all right, I'll listen to what he says and I'll try. And he did. He came off heroin and he stopped taking all psychotropic medication.
Wow.
Completely. And he came up to me in the street. I think he was about 32 years old. And he said for the first time since the age of 16, he was taking nothing. He didn't take anything. And he was pleased. But his life wasn't easy, because you can't, if you've spent your life from the age of 16 being a criminal and then you stop, you can't just pick up your life as if you hadn't been a criminal for 16 years. And that's where it's very difficult for them, where, if possible, they should be given assistance. But it's not psychological assistance, really. It's practical assistance, and insofar as it's psychological, it should be interest in them as human beings.
But that was probably the first time anyone had told him, no, I won't do this for you, and set a boundary.
Yes, almost certainly. And of course, it took much more time to say no than to just write a prescription. Another thing I used to do, I don't know whether I'm allowed to swear or use bad language.
Go for it.
on this program, but prisoners would come in and they'd say, "I've got this fucking headache," and I'd say, "Well, before we go any further, can you explain to me the difference between a headache and a fucking headache?" and they would say, "Well, that's the way I speak. That's the way I talk." I said, "Yes, that's what I'm complaining. That's what I'm complaining of." And then I would say, he would ask me, "Well, why shouldn't I speak like that?" That's the way I speak. And I'd say, well, supposing at the end of this consultation, I say, now here are some fucking pills, and now fuck off. And you would be surprised.
Please tell me you did that.
No, I didn't do that. Well, I said that, but then I would say, you would be very surprised, wouldn't you? And he said yes, and I'd say, well, we're equal. I don't talk to you like that, and you don't talk to me like that. But what's interesting is that this was the first time anyone had ever said anything like that to them. So, and I had many such patients. And I didn't actually have I had no power to stop them. I mean, I couldn't, if they continued to use that language, I couldn't refuse to treat them. But they did stop using that language. At least in front of me.
Amazing. And it probably strengthened the therapeutic relationship, I can imagine.
Well, I think so. I mean, I wanted to be more respected than liked, because because I wasn't their friend. And I remember one patient said to me, when I refused to prescribe him what he wanted, he said, I thought you were here to help me. I said, I'm here to do what I think is right for you, which may not be the same as what you think is right for you.
Yes. That was a good answer. I have to remember that. Because I often find it uncomfortable, the expectations that patients come in with, and having to set boundaries, and because you're very much now giving a service rather than as a psychiatrist.
Well, you're the patient becomes a customer, and the customer is never wrong. But the relationship between a doctor and a patient is not that of a shopkeeper and a customer, or shouldn't be.
Yes.
I mean, I actually believe, I suppose you could call it in paternalism. I think a doctor is obliged to think of what is right for his patient, and what is right for his patient may not be all that the doctor knows.
There's something that's been getting a lot of attention lately, and that is the dramatic effect lifestyle and exercise have on our well-being and mental health. But the difficult thing is to stick with the routine. So what you need to do is to go and check out Pitch Fitness Center. It's a premium wellness gym, and it's gorgeous. It gives you that hotel spa feeling with every exercise, and their kids club is even open on Sunday. So head on over to pitch.ch, that's pitch.ch, and get a discount with our promo code Psychobabble podcast today. See you there.
Okay, I also want to talk about the toxic cult of sentimentality, if I might completely shift us here a little. So something I notice a lot when I speak to women now is if we're having an argument, if we go back and forth on an issue, then I'm told this a lot, because I'll say what I think and I'll disapprove. The last argument they'll use, and that will just be the end of it, is I don't think we should judge. I think we should just be nice. I don't think we should judge. And I noticed, and that's the end. You can't go past that point. If you're told now we should just be nice, you shouldn't be so judgy, Hannah, then that's the end of the conversation. And that was also such a relief when I read you, that you talk about this, and also in relation to these criminals that you work with. Can you say something about this non-judgmentalism?
Well, I mean, I used sometimes to have patients who when asked to describe themselves, would say almost beatifically, as if they were turning themselves into saints, I'm non-judgmental.
Mm.
And I say, is that a good thing? And I say, you've made a judgment that you shouldn't make a judgment, and therefore you're in contradiction. In fact, the whole of human life is judgment. You judge all the time, and you must judge. You can't not judge. You can't be completely neutral. I mean, obviously, people make a difference. People, because of their lack of vocabulary, don't make a distinction between making a judgment and being censorious.
Yeah.
And what I try to do is to suggest to people that if they continued in their way of life and with the judgments that in fact they were making, then there was no point in complaining about the consequences. I didn't actually say what you're doing is very bad. I simply said, if you continue in this way, then the consequences, the natural consequences, are this and that. If you object to those consequences, then you have to change. If you don't, if you decide that the consequences, though bad, are preferable to the difficulty of changing, then that's up to you.
Yes.
But
yeah, we see that so I did this psychotherapy degree here at the University of Zurich, and then we were exposed to all these terrible different schools of psychotherapy, and what's very in the wind, all the rage now is this emotionally focused therapy. I don't know if you've been exposed to this particular nonsense.
Well, I've been retired for quite a long time, so
yes, it's so, and it's exactly that. You're supposed to just it's all about the feeling. So you take that's what you talk about first, second, and last, and then you approach it non-judgmentally. That's the whole. You investigate your feeling, you bring it to the forefront, and then you look at it with a non-judgmental mind, and then that is supposed to make you feel better.
That is to preserve people in their present condition, and if their present condition were desirable, then you can ask, well, what on earth are they going to a therapist for?
Exactly.
Presumably there must be something wrong, or alternatively, perhaps they're just narcissists who want to talk about themselves.
Exactly. I actually countered that a couple of weeks ago in a session. That what are we doing here? Because all the conversation kept revolving around the past, the past, and how everything now was actually just great. And then I said, what are we doing? It's a problem.
I prefer the idea almost of a kind of Socratic dialogue, not at the elevated level of Plato, but nevertheless, I think you have to, or you attempt to uncover the contradictions in what people are telling themselves, because I do believe that people are capable of taking thought and examining their own lives and so on, but it is rather painful. And
yes, and I see that a lot of my colleagues, they were opposed to bringing further pain. They were, and we're all very aware that we're afraid of pain. We're afraid of sacrifice. Sacrifice has become almost a bad word that you should even you shouldn't encourage self-improvement, because if you want to improve something, that means you're telling that person that they're not absolutely good in the moment. So that's one of those things that I'm quite disappointed in 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 our field that we have done away with self-improvement because everything is supposed to be equal, everything is supposed to be just as good now as they are tomorrow.
But there's something fundamentally dishonest about that, because obviously the person who has come to see you has some kind of problem. And if you're saying everything is all right and so on, the problem will remain, and that person will continue to come to see you, while at the same time you're doing absolutely nothing for him.
I guess the question is, what has that done to us? What is it doing to us, do you think?
You mean as a society, or at least in large numbers? Well, I think it's turning us, not us, of course, turning people into narcissists, narrow-minded, focused on themselves, in the way that a hypochondriac regards twinges in his body as a sign of illness, and is constantly taking his pulse or whatever. So we become, if you like, psychologically hypochondriacal. And I remember a patient saying to me that I want to find myself, and I say it's much more important that you should be able to lose yourself than that you should be able to find yourself. Because in losing yourself, you actually find yourself, if you like, but furthermore, you disregard all the problems, because life is always unsatisfactory. Once you realize that dissatisfaction is permanent and there's no avoiding it, partly because your own desires are contradictory. On the one hand, you want to be completely free, and on the other hand, you want to be completely secure. Well, you can't have them both.
No.
And yet you want both. So once you realize that dissatisfaction is the permanent condition of mankind, you are liberated from trying to seek perfection.
Exactly.
And that enables you to do things constructively, without that occupy you, that make you content and happy, without the expectation that your life will be perfect.
That is completely gone from
Yes,
the psychological
disaster.
community. They don't understand that we're feeling our best when we are striving towards a goal, and when we are in reaching that goal, we experience positive emotions. So this, my colleagues, they're trying to help patients just be happy in the moment, and they have these new therapy groups that are called enjoyment groups. So in German it's Genuss, and they call it Genuss training. So enjoyment training, that you just sit in the now, and you're supposed to just conjure up satisfaction, emotions of satisfaction in the moment.
To my mind, that it's not only bogus, but almost disgusting. Because, I mean, there's an awful lot in the world to be interested in, other than your emotions of the time.
Right.
And actually what one needs is to be interested in, to have a kind of passionate, if you like, interest in the world about you. And it doesn't, in a way, it doesn't matter what it is. My patients, when I say, you need to lose yourself, and this is the problem with my analysis, they would say, well, how do you lose yourself?
How do you become loose?
How do you become really interested in something? And that I find difficult to answer, because ever since I can remember, I was very interested in something. What I was interested in has changed over the years and continues to change, but nevertheless, I can't imagine a life in which the only thing that interested me was me.
Mhm.
Because I'm not
Yes,
that interesting, actually. And
that's yeah.
uh, and so it doesn't matter in a way, what you're interested in, except that some interests are more constructive than others and engage the mind much more than others. But how people go about becoming interested and losing themselves, I haven't worked that out. I
Well, I
don't
think
know.
it's what I see lacking is encouragement to become part of something. People are so detached from their communities or not a part of communities at all. And that's a big problem that I see. And I think
Yes,
if you're interested in anything, that will then come with in a club or in a religious community, or you would then uh, be do something for others and be something to others.
yeah. Well, I think that's very good, but it also has its dangers because you can. I mean, I've just read a very interesting book about a a Maoist, the leader of a Maoist groupuscule, a tiny group of people who became very interested in Maoism and lived their Maoism and so on in a kind of cult, and that was a solution to their own problems,
Yeah.
in a sense, but then they found themselves caught as in a kind of spider's web, and if anything, it was worse. So you have to be a bit careful about communities. It rather depends on little communities can be very dangerous as well. So uh,
Right.
uh,
Sects and
let's say,
such. Yes. Yeah.
supposing, I mean, I take this example because I'm a bit interested in it myself. Supposing you become interested in insect life, you will soon find that there is, I don't like the word community, but there are other people who are interested in insect life. And therefore you will make contact with people who are interested in insect life. So in that sense,
But that's
it's
good. Then your interest has led you in contact, because a lot of people don't have contact with others at all, is what I see. They're so
yes, yeah,
incredibly
no, I think
lonely.
that's right. I mean, but I don't like the word community because nowadays it's used in such a way that anybody who has anything in common with somebody else is said to be a member of that person's community. So, for example, if you take tattooing, which is a very interesting subject in itself,
Mm.
people will now talk about the tattooed community just because people have tattoos, or So, uh,
Right.
but as the community in the sense of, I've used the example of people being interested in insect life. That seems to me a very good thing.
Hmm.
I mean, I have nothing against that at all, and it seems a very necessary thing.
Yes. And yeah. So that's self-interest is a way to, interest in something is a way to do the opposite of finding yourself, to lose yourself. That's why
Yeah.
it's funny. That's also, I heard that a lot, because when you first get a new patient, you start a session, you talk about goals, what they want, what they expect, and this find myself is something very, very common. And also, it was like on repeat. And I was thinking, where did they get this from? Where did they hear this? Because they all said, I want to be as happy as I was when I was a child. I want to
Well,
again find the happiness that I had when I was a child. Was that something does that ring a bell?
well, I didn't meet very many people who were happy as a child,
Oh
actually.
yeah, that's true. I think we had a very different clientele, you and me,
Yeah.
as a very
Well, I mean,
affluent.
yeah. I mean, in a way, that it's very sad, of course, because it. Well, in fact, they want to return to the womb, as it were, And there's no natural progression through life from childhood to adulthood and so on. And you see this actually in many manifestations. I mean, one thing that is terrible is that the word pupil has almost disappeared from the English language, and it has been replaced almost entirely by student.
Yeah.
And even a 3-year-old is a student. Well, this is ridiculous. You grow from being a pupil into being a student. And a student is someone whose studies are relatively, not entirely, but relatively self-directed. Whereas a pupil, I mean, the teacher knows what he or she has to impart to the pupil, and does his or her best to do so. The best method of doing that is not usually being violent or aggressive or anything like that, but nevertheless, teacher is in a situation of authority towards the child, because if he or she were not in that position of authority, there would be no reason for having a school in the first place. The very fact that children need to be taught means that they need to have an authority over them. And the fact that we no longer use the word pupil, use the word student, seems to make children, the authorities in their own lives earlier and earlier. And this is disastrous. But at the other end of the age scale, we are now entering the first generation of geriatric adolescents, or adolescent geriatrics, who conduct themselves as if, even dress themselves and have the same tastes as they had when they were adolescents. So it's not eternal childhood that we've had, but eternal adolescence. And this seems to me extremely undignified.
When I first stepped out and said, this is disappointing, I became disillusioned with what we were doing, what I was being taught, because we were sitting in these groups of with all the colleagues. Everyone's working at the different departments. So in every department, I was at the hospital, and then I was at an outpatient clinic and such. We'd always have these meetings where we'd sit, psychologists, nurses with these psychotherapy degrees, us psychiatrists, and we'd talk about the patients and what we were doing, give each other advice of what to do next. And so this is where I would take it in and see what they were doing, and just thinking hello. And then so stepping out of that, I had then you, who were such a great influence and had voices to turn to. How is that for you? When did that happen for you?
Well, I think it more or less happened spontaneously, I suppose, because I had just talked to an enormous number of people, and I realized an awful lot of what was the kind of orthodoxy was simply untrue. To give you a couple of examples, I mean, I've already given the example of the idea of heroin addiction as a disease like any other disease, something that just happens to people. Well, I realized that this was false, and it seemed to me it was obviously false. And if people were prepared to swallow something that was so obviously false, what else were they swallowing that was obviously false? Another thing was, we are told that prisoners have a low IQ, and that low IQ has some kind of causative effect on their behaviour. All I can say is, obviously with some exceptions, the vast majority of prisoners had an IQ perfectly adequate to not committing crimes.
Yeah.
Their low IQ had very little to do with what they had done. So again, here was something an orthodoxy which seemed to me completely false.
And so did you get
once you
backlash? Did you tell your colleagues? You must have worked with psychologists, and that was during the time where they were developing these things, saying, this is addiction, this is disease. They were expanding the DSM or the ICD.
yes, well, conflict would be a strong word. I would disagree, but I was very fortunate. I was just in the last period when independent practice was possible, before bureaucracy got hold of controlled everything and imposed certain procedures and ways of thinking on everyone. So, for example, I was able to say, I remember when a prison officer came up to me, and there was something about a prisoner, I can't remember exactly what, and he said, the government policy is that the person should be treated in this way or that way. I can't remember exactly in what circumstances it was. And I said, well, I don't care what the government says. I'm the doctor around here, and I decide. And if and if what I do is wrong, then I take the responsibility. Then it's my responsibility. I can't blame the government, and I'm not going to blame you, the prison officer. I take the decision. I take the responsibility. If it goes wrong, it's me. But that is no longer or becoming almost impossible.
It is. You very much, yes, intertwined in this web of lies and anti-truths.
Yeah.
Yes. And frustratingly, and I find that the diagnostic system, almost the most frustrating, because it's so, they used to be, I don't know what your opinion is on that, but the neuropsychiatric diagnosis sort of separate from the personality disorders and these other, they're very, very different categorically. And then now, once I worked with a lot of borderline girls, had a lot of girls who cut themselves, self-injuries, borderliners. And I'd worked with one for years. And then she was, I went on my honeymoon, and then she was institutionalized, and obviously because that was too much to handle for her. And then I came back, and she'd been in this institution for a while. She came back to me, and the diagnosis was completely different, just from borderline to bipolar. And I was and I had to really argue, and I had then a conflict afterwards with the psychologist on the phone, and saying, I know this girl, this is not a bipolar, and it's a big problem when you have conflicting diagnosis. And for that, the poor patient who said, now I have bipolar disorder, and she was put on lithium. It was a huge thing. And that's why I'm very interested also in this bracket creep that's come, that now you could just call, if you're depressed and then you're happy and then you're depressed, or what you said, sad, disappointed, then you fulfill the criteria for a bipolar nowadays, which is a serious neuropsychiatric disorder.
I mean, part of the problem, as I mentioned before, is that there's no biological marker to distinguish between things. And the fact is, if you add up all the prevalences given in the DSM-5 for the various conditions, it turns out that almost everybody has something. Mm-hmm. So there's no such thing as being free from psychiatric disorder, in which case the very concept of psychiatric disorder is nugatory. It's worthless. I mean, if everyone has a psychiatric condition, it would be like saying everyone has cancer, or just ridiculous. And it would be very easy to invent endless new diseases. If I think of myself, for example, I wouldn't say I'm a compulsive book buyer, but I have an enormous number of books. I love buying books. I never buy a book. I don't buy books just to accumulate books. I buy
Mhm.
books that I intend to read, but I don't always get round to reading them. So I have some instinct as to what book may one day come in useful for me. But you could say that my inability to pass by a bookshop with books in a language I can read, and my excessive interest in books, you could turn it into a condition. You could turn it into and in fact it was.
Absolutely. I could prescribe you Wellbutrin right now, just in
Yes.
case.
Yeah. And in fact, in the early 19th century, there was a rather satirical book called The Bibliomania, This Fatal Disease.
Mm. Well, I guess it is faithful if you don't have the resources to buy all the books that you want, and every time you pass, you say, "Doctor, I just can't, I can't afford."
Yes, what can I do?
Yes.
Yeah. So, So, I mean, the list of, to regard all human traits as pathological is pathological.
Would
And
you
that,
think that there's because there's this faction of psychiatrists who say that all criminals have some form of insanity?
that's
That
ridiculous. It's just rubbish. It's just nonsense. It is true, of course, that there are a small number of criminals who have committed usually rather incomprehensible crimes,
yeah.
um, uh, and who don't actually, those who could actually be treated are not treated. It is said that 70% of prisoners have some kind of psychiatric disorder, which to me is the equivalent of a screen memory. It's a kind of screen statistic, which is an excuse for the failure to treat the raving lunatics that there are, of a
Yeah.
relatively small number of them. But we can't even deal with, despite our enormous apparatus, we can't deal with a small number of raving lunatics. And our excuse is that how can you expect us to do so because 70% of the prison population has psychiatric disorders? Well,
Mhm.
it's nonsense. And it certainly was in the prison in which I worked for many years.
Yeah, it was very interesting. I don't know if you followed Anders Behring Breivik in Norway. The murdered 27 young people with a machine gun on the little island. The political.
He killed 77 people.
So, sorry,
77.
yes, 70, yes, exactly. But he was there was a huge debate. The psychiatric community came under a lot of scrutiny because they tried to label him insane. They tried to pin a type of psychopathy on him, and he wanted to be I would also rather be in a Norwegian prison than a mental institution than in Dikemark. I actually got a job in Dikemark where they would have sent him because I really wanted to go into forensic psychiatry. And there's you can't compare it. Now he has an apartment all to himself, and it would also delegitimize his whole manifesto, all of his opinions. But I think that conflict was very revealing. And it also revealed this faction of psychiatrists who do believe that if you commit such crimes, then you have to have a form of, there has to be a psychopathy behind it.
Yeah, it's a completely circular argument, and I've seen it argued in court, and it's a ridiculous argument. The fact is that the man must have had a psychiatric disorder to do what he did, and then you explain what he did by the fact that he had a psychiatric disorder. So it's completely circular. In the case of, what was his name? I've forgotten. I'll think of it. The Norwegian chap. there was one reason why I think they probably wanted to find him insane, and that was that in Norway the maximum sentence anyone can serve is 22 years, which is
Yes.
clearly ridiculous. For having killed 77 people, there should be no question of him ever coming out of prison. Not because you think he's going to do it again, but because it's a signal that if you go and kill 77 people, that is the end of your life as a free person. That's it. But because that is not available, life sentence, meaning the person remaining in prison for the rest of his life, is not available legally in Norway. What they will do, I think, at the end of 22 years is they will find a psychiatric diagnosis, which will mean that he will be confined in a psychiatric hospital, rather than allowing him to leave the prison, which is what they would have to do if they just straightforwardly followed the law.
Yeah.
So it's a form of intellectual and moral corruption. What should have happened, of course, is he should just have been told, you go to prison for the rest of your life. There is no hope of you ever coming out of prison. And actually, the European Court of Human Rights, which is a terrible institution, in Britain there are about 50 prisoners who have been given a sentence of life imprisonment, meaning you will never come out of prison. And they appealed to the European Court of Human Rights, saying that this was against their human rights. And the court ruled that against Britain, which then fortunately took no notice of the ruling, saying that everyone has to have the hope of rehabilitation and so on. And this seems to me an extraordinary thing to say in a continent in which, 50 million, 100 million people have been killed not all that long ago. I mean, if you had Himmler, for example, he committed suicide. If you had Himmler, would you say, well, now that you realized that what you did was wrong and you've promised that you're not going to do it again, we're going to release you because there's no point in keeping you in prison anymore. I mean,
but we have also come, I mean, Anders Behring Breivik is now really living a life of luxury. He has video games, and he also did an appeal to the Human Rights Court because of the way he was treated in a Norwegian prison. And that's what I'm saying. I mean, I hope that he is sent to Dikemark afterwards, because that's a lot worse. You don't get video games, and you don't get all this mattress on the floor, basically, in comparison. So I think it would have been much better.
Prisoners in my prison, which was, of course, not as luxurious as a Norwegian prisoner, but they were terrified of being sent to psychiatric facilities. And there was an expression they used, "You're not going to nut me off, are you, doctor?"
Really?
Which is to send them. They were terrified.
Yeah.
And
you should be. You should be.
When they went to hospital, even ordinary hospital, not psychiatric hospital, they were very soon wanted to go back to prison. They preferred prison to hospital. And many of the prisoners, the British police, to be caught by the British police, you either have to be extremely stupid or almost determined to be caught by the British police. But anyway, I used to ask the prisoners in confidence, of course, everything is confidential, I didn't speak to the administration or anything like that. I would ask them what they'd really done rather than what they were accused of having done, and of course they'd all done tons more, many times more than what they were accused of having done. But I used to ask them, between you and me, do you actually like coming into prison? And many of them did. I mean, they didn't want to stay in prison for a very long time, but they wanted relief from their life outside. And many of them, particularly the drug addicts, only the drug addicts really, they came in looking like as if they'd come out of Auschwitz. They were malnourished, thin, ill, and of course they've got all kinds of scars where they injected. And after 3 months or 4 months in the prison, they were perfectly healthy again. And some of them actually asked to be sent to prison. They wanted to be sent to prison because it was a kind of health farm in their locality. It was their way of escaping their way of life. Unfortunately, usually, at least if they were young, they would, as soon as they got out again, they would return to the way of life which produced this problem in the first place. But I would say possibly about a third of the prisoners actually were very relieved to be sent to prison.
That's very telling.
And it's very sad, of course.
Yeah.
It's awful.
Yeah.
I mean, I told in one of my stories, case of a girl. She was 17 when I saw her, but she murdered her lesbian lover. I think the lesbian lover was 15 or 16, under the influence of cannabis and drink. And her story was a terrible one. I mean, really appalling. Her mother was an alcoholic who, like Jamaican men, the Jamaican man, her father abandoned her before her birth. Then her mother took up with a crack and cocaine addict who was in and out of prison. Her half-brother sexually abused her from a very early age for years and years. And then when the daughter, went, I think, aged 14, to her mother and said that she was being sexually abused by her brother, her mother threw her out of the house, and she had to go to social services. She was in a children's home. And then when the social services, in their wisdom, decided at the age of 16 she was able to live on her own, they gave her a flat and an income, and she took up with this girl, and she murdered her in a drunken cannabis fueled fight. I remember seeing the video of her chasing the girl who was killed
Yeah.
2 nights like this. Anyway, so I was asked to go and see her to see whether there was any psychiatric disorder, and I expected to find some terrible person.
Mm-hmm.
The person was not terrible at all. In fact, I liked her. She was a very nice person. She was very intelligent, and she was very happy in prison because it was the first time in her life that anyone had treated her with reasonable respect, and where her life was also reasonably predictable. She could predict what would happen tomorrow and the next day. And so she liked being in prison. And actually what would happen is that what would have happened is that in prison she would have got an education, and there they would have given her a proper education. And when she came out, she would have been prepared for life outside. And I was one can't be sure, but I think she'd probably do quite well in life. Now there you can see how circumstances caused the crime, but what a terrible world she came from. And she didn't. I mean, I was opposed. There were lots of psychologists and psychiatrists for the defense, claiming that she was psychologically or psychiatrically disordered. And I was saying that I was for the prosecution. I was saying she was normal. And that actually, that sounds harsher, because the psychiatrists on the other side seemed to be sympathizing with her. But
yes,
first of all, I was just saying what I thought was actually true. That's the first thing. But secondly, I thought the truth was much better for her than this kind of bogus sentimental sympathy for her. And now what happened to her? I know that she was found guilty of murder. They did not accept the other side's argument. My argument was that if she had not been drunk, and if she had not taken cannabis, she would not have done what she did. And in English law, being voluntarily intoxicated is not a
reason for insanity.
Yeah, no, it's not a mitigating circumstance.
Yeah,
which I think is correct. I think they've watered down that law, but I think that is essentially a correct law. And anyway, there we can see that going to prison was actually the saving of her. I remember another case. I went to Manchester University, and I was with a lot of students, and we were talking about whether there was any value in prison or not. And you would expect students probably to think that prison is a very bad thing, and so on and so forth. And there, on the panel with me, there was a very nice woman, but she had been to prison for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the courts are extremely reluctant to send women to prison in the first place. And so if she had served 10 years, almost certainly she was a murderess. And that was, of course, I didn't ask her that. Anyway, she was there. She's going around the country saying how bad prison is.
Mm-hmm.
But even the little that I was able to deduce from her, she said that she was living in terrible social circumstances, and when she went to prison, she was opposed to the whole system and fought against it, but eventually she realized that this was pointless, and eventually she got a university degree, while she was in prison. And it seemed to me that here was an example where prison was actually the saving of her. It saved her life.
Mm-hmm.
If it hadn't been for prison, she would have continued in the same terrible way. And there she was, going around the country, making propaganda against the prison. Of course, in a public forum. I mean, I liked her. She was a nice person. I found I couldn't actually say this in public. First, because people would think, what a monster, how nasty you are to this poor woman.
Yeah.
But also because probably she's still a bit fragile.
Yeah.
So if I exposed the contradiction in what she was saying, and pointed out to her that her life had actually been saved, vastly improved by a long time in prison, she would have been very upset. So I wasn't able to speak the truth. Someone more ruthless than I would have spoken the truth, perhaps. But
I don't think it would have done much. So what can we do? What is, do you have any advice for me when it comes to standing up to the psychological community? I know you don't like that word, but to improve anything, get rid of all this psychobabble.
I don't think that there's any more than you can do than you are doing. You just have to be strong in your belief in the truth.
Yes. That's great. But thank you so much for coming on. It's been amazing for me. This was the best conversation I've had yet. So very looking forward to it. Couldn't sleep.
Well, thank you.
It's not every day you get to talk to one of your heroes.
It's been a pleasure.
And thank you all for listening to Psychobabble. I really enjoyed doing this episode, and I hope you enjoyed it too. And we've got a lot of things coming. Please email me, leave a comment if there is a topic you want me to cover or someone you want me to invite on the show. Thank you so much for your support. It means a lot to me. And please consider becoming a paid subscriber to Psychobabble so that I'll have more wiggle room to do more great content. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.